Good evening, everyone. Live here from central London in Westminster. And I want to bring you the King's Speech and what it means for landlords, but overall, the housing industry as well. So, a lot of people have been waiting for this King's Speech, and of course, influenced by Labour and where they're coming in at and what impact they're going to have in the overall. Now, today I'm going to be talking specifically about housing. I'm not going to be touching on the other topics, but some interesting things there. Some things we already knew that were going to happen, and I just want to go through them, each one of them together. So, I know there's probably people joining from different platforms, so bear with me. I don't know if you can see my screen. No, you can't. Okay, so we're going to start from this article from Good Lord, who always has some very good, material. I don't know if you can see my screen. Bear with me. Okay, yeah. So this article from Good Lord. So the Renters' Rights Bill. And of course, if you are paying attention, you'll notice that we're moving away from the Renters Reform Bill. So it seems that Labour has taken the Renters Reform Bill that is now dead. For you guys who've been following, you'll know that they didn't pass it through. Of course, when the election was called out. So Labour has called this the Renters' Rights Bill. The Renters' Rights Bill looks to be Labour's version of the Renters' Reform Bill, which did not pass through Parliament. The new legislation would look to provide a functioning sector to those who want it and to secure stepping stone for aspiring homeowners. So what this effectively means is giving more rights to tenants. I believe the wording around there was landlords not violating tenants' rights, not taking advantage of tenants, and tenants being able to have a safe and habitable home without being harassed, without being threatened, without being at risk of being evicted just because they are requesting or trying to ask for the standards that they would expect. So this is where it's going. And of course, we all knew that the Labour Party were going to be more tenant friendly. That being said, Conservative were tenant friendly as they were. I mean, I had a lot of conversation with landlords and even tenants, and they felt that Conservative were actually fighting their corner, a lot of tenants. So something interesting to see there. But of course, Labour want to make a point, and they're coming in aggressive. So, what do we have? This bill will look to cover policies such as abolishing Section 21. Now, we all knew this was going to happen. If you've been following our live videos, you'll know that there is a difference between the Conservative. The Conservative wanted to take it easy in terms of making sure that the courts were up to date and functioning before they could do this. Labour seems to want to do this very aggressively, very quickly. So, strengthening tenants' rights and protections by giving tenants the power to challenge rent increase and end the practice of rental bidding wars. Now, I have said before, the strengthening tenants' rights, it will be interesting to find out what that actually looks like, because currently tenants do have rights when it comes to rental increase. In first, they can take it to the first tier tribunal if they don't believe that it's if they believe they're being taken advantage of, if it's not market rate. So there are already powers there. I'd be very keen to find out as to what more powers that are going to be given tenants to be able to dispute any rent increases. Currently, the standard is, landlords won't increase rents during the fixed term tenancy of a year, for example. If they want to do it beyond the year and it's a 24-month tenancy, then ideally what they want is to make that clear on the tenancy agreement as to how much and when that's going to be. So otherwise, there are other mechanisms such as Section 13. And of course, it all depends on whether you're on a periodic tenancy and so forth and so forth. So going back to this, pet inlet. So this is, again, funny enough, this is a big issue for landlords. And I believe it's more so because of past experience that they've had with tenants that have pets, and perhaps they've not given the property back to them in a great condition, whether that be damages from that pet, dog, cat, scratching surfaces and so forth, whether that be the cleaning of it. I know certainly I have a very strong sense of smell, but I love pets. But some landlords, of course, together with smoking, I'm comparing smoking, but you guys, I'm sure that I have pets. I'm sure you out there that are going to have pets will probably give me a bashing as to how can you compare pets with smoking. But overall, it's a sense of smell that perhaps it's not going to be pleasant for some people. I've had cats, I have dogs. Currently, I only have a cat, and I couldn't see myself coming home and not seeing my furry friend at home waiting for me. So I get it, and especially I understand the impact it has for people, especially from a mental health point of view, anxiety, and just overall, it's a great experience. For you guys that don't have pets, probably won't understand, but I get it, and it will be interesting to find out what mechanisms the government's going to put in place so that landlords can have the peace of mind of being able to rent these properties to people who have pets and not having those concerns. I remember when the Conservatives were in power and they were proposing this, they were saying something about a compulsory insurance that the tenants would have to pay if they wanted their pets, which I think that's sensible. How much that's going to be, how much that's going to be increased, and it does also put the question across as to how this is going to put in place with the Tenant Act fee ban of 2019. Because if you're forcing a tenant to take out an insurance because you have pets, then there is something that they have to do there to balance that out. So decent home standards for the private sector, of course, applying Arab's law to the sector. For those who are not familiar with this, is of course a very tragic story of a young child passing away, and it was there was evidence to say that it was based on the standard of the property where the baby was living in. Very sad, and of course it sparked this as to we don't want children or even adults, for that fact, having to risk their lives just because they're renting a property that's not habitable. So totally agree with this, and I know a lot of landlords that do as well. We need to raise the standards, right? And we have a digital private rented sector database putting together information for landlords, tenants, and councils in all one place. Now, I hear a lot of you out there, we're taking this surveillance to a next level, all this data. What's the government doing with this? And that's a good question. What are they doing with this? How are they using this information to make it better, not only for tenants, but also for landlords? Because it's a two-way thing. There are stakeholders involved in this, including the council. So it will be interesting to find out how that data's work-based works and supporting quicker and cheaper resolution for disputes within the sector. The introduction of new ombudsman service to provide fair and impartial binding resolutions for landlords and tenants. So currently, if you're not aware, the letting agents do have to be a member of a resolution scheme, but landlords don't. And I do agree that if landlords decide to actually take it upon themselves to rent out properties themselves, that they should be held to a certain standards, that they can't have this, let's call it a loophole whereby, okay, if I'm a landlord and I rent it out, I let my property out myself, then I don't have to abide by the industry standards that letting agents do. Well, I don't think that should be necessarily the case, because it does mean that then somehow the tenant receives a less standards from the landlord, because it just really doesn't work that way. In fact, I have a story to share whereby it is unfortunate, but I was speaking to an agent and they were telling me whereby they offer a let-only service to a landlord, and the landlords, they are senior. They're well in their 80s, and they decide not to take management, which this agent is, fair enough. There's a good percentage of properties that they take on that are just managed by the landlords. But the issue is that the tenant who has moved in, they are complaining, not complaining, because the agent is friendly with the tenant and kind of touches base with the tenant. How are you? How you getting on? They have a great relationship, but the tenant is really, really upset and disappointed in the way that the landlord manages the property. I mean, that can have the fact that the landlords are 80 plus, I'm sure has an impact on it, but it's just not fair on the tenant and the landlords being able to bypass certain laws or regulations just because those regulations are only for the letting agents. So going back to the King's Speech and the points that are in there, and it's really interesting actually because we all knew there were going to be some stuff in the woodworks to come out from their manifesto, and they were going to be adding, and more and more landlords are more concerned as to what else is going to come out. What more can be there? And other landlords are kind of relieved, saying, well, you know what? The quicker they get this out, the better, because we were absolutely tired and just having to wait for 4 or 5 years for the renters reform bill from the Conservative didn't happen, and now we're back to square one. Just get it over and done with. And I know a lot of organizations that are helping and supporting landlords are pushing for the same thing. They're saying, you know what, you Labour, please just get it over and done with. This should be at the top of your priority, not only for tenants but also for landlords. So strengthening local council enforcement powers, making it easier for councils to identify and find landlords and drive them out of the sector. Totally agree. If landlords are giving, and letting agents for that matter, right? But if landlords and certain agents are giving the industry a bad name, then it's time to do a U-turn on this. It's time to bring up the standards to another level. So I totally agree with that. And that takes us to I've been talking about this for a couple of years, English devolution bill. Now, for you guys who are not familiar with devolution, it's giving more power to the council. And there is a saying that it's because the council are the ones who have the boots on the ground, the eyes there, the ears. If they have to make any changes, if they have to make strategic decisions, then it's best that they can do that and they have the power to do it rather than being the central government and taking years to make adjustments. I mean, from that aspect, I guess it makes sense. But I was actually having a chat with a landlord who has a HMO in the Camden Borough. And it's just amazing how when government or councils are given the green light to charge a registration fee, a license fee, however way they want to package it. And they start with a certain sum. And before you know it, a couple of years, 3 years goes past, and then that doubles and triples. And that's been adding to cost to landlords. And that ultimately has an impact on the rental rates that we're seeing and the rental increases. I mean, it's cause and effect. This example of the HMO, I remember when the HMO additional licensing had come out, this was something along the lines of around £500. Speaking to this landlord who's having to have to renew his HMO, costing him £1,200. £1,200. That's more than doubled. It's crazy, but again, it's how the government works and the councils and everything else. I understand there's administration. I understand that there is costs and expenditure attached to everything, but you talk about greedy landlords. A lot of times, I do see a lot of renters saying, greedy landlords, and I always say, really, greedy landlords, or is it greedy landlords? Greedy agents, maybe, council, governments, lenders, developers. There are so many stakeholders here that it seems that the focus is purely based on landlords, and we need to start looking elsewhere to resolve the problems in the housing industry that we have in the UK. And it seems that Labour are on track to want to do that, of course, with the plan of building 1.5 million houses. And we'll talk a little bit about that. But if you want to go into depth on that, make sure you watch my live video from last week where we did dive deep. So, devolution. So King Charles III mentioned Labour's plan to introduce English devolution bill, which will provide new powers to metro mayors and local authorities. For you landlords who have properties here in London, I'm sure you're getting the shivers with knowing that if Sadiq Khan has more powers, what will that mean for your property and your portfolio? And that is an interesting question because we're going to be diving deep on that next week. And this is an episode that you definitely don't want to miss. So make sure you subscribe so you can be prompted when that video comes out. Sadiq Khan, the powers he has or going to have, and how that potentially is going to impact landlords, tenants, but also the overall rental market. So let's dive into this devolution. Creating a more ambitious standardized devolution framework into legislation, giving local leaders more power over strategic planning, local transport networks, and so forth. Making devolution the default setting, making it easier to provide devolved powers quickly to more areas. And again, if you felt that councils had already too much power, well, you want to watch this space over the course of the next few years and months. Improve and unblock local decision making. So they want to make things faster. Okay, fair enough. I'm all for that. Red tape, removing any red tape, especially if it's going to support all stakeholders. Empower local communities. So, a draft on the leasehold and common hold reform bill. Now, this is a more complex challenge. How fast and how much the Labour government is going to be able to make these changes. There are a lot of people, a lot of wealthy people who will be impacted by any changes to leaseholds, and at least current leaseholds that are out there right now, and freeholds. And these people have deep pockets, and they are more than willing to challenge the government and the council with high profile lawyers in court. And I believe that's something that the government may want to avoid. Let's not forget there's very powerful people that have made their wealth through property and have a lot of money tied in to in freehold and leasehold. So it will be interesting to see how they are going to tackle this. But let's have a look. So the leasehold and reform bill was passed final day of the Conservative government. So if you remember, there is already a leasehold and freehold reform bill, but there were parts of it that the Labour wanted to actually amend, and it wasn't pulled through. So it'll be interesting as to whether they are now going to be able to put what they wanted in the first place in place. So, however, despite the bill not passing, there are still several question marks on how it will be actioned and implemented. Labour will soon publish a draft legislation that will aim to provide homeowners with greater rights and powers over their homes. The party plans to further reform bills and freeholds while also implementing the Leasehold Reform Bill Act 2024. The government first mentioned the plans to bring leasehold systems to an end in its manifesto. However, following the King's speech, further details on how this will be done were released. So this includes reinvigorating common holds. So for you that not familiar with common holds, in fact, contrary to the name, it's not very common here in the UK. It was something that was introduced quite a few years ago, but it's not the norm. It's definitely not the default. So it seems what they want to do is make it the norm. Tackling existing ground rents. For you landlords who have not had or homeowners who have not been stung by the very awful ground rent doubling, I do believe that that's just something that is taking the mick, quite frankly. So, having ground rent that doubles every 10 years, by the end of 30 years, that's going to be a lot of money that you're paying on ground rent. And it's something that definitely needs to be changed. enacting remaining law commission recommendations. So these reforms will be extended and applied to England and Wales. Planning an infrastructure bill. I won't dive too deep into this, but it is of course the plan that the Labour has at the moment to so get Britain building, including through planning reform, as they seek to accelerate the delivery of high quality infrastructure and housing. And we talked a little bit about this last week. Improving local planning decision making, increasing local planning authority capacity, streamlining the delivery of the process for critical infrastructure. And I'm glad to see this, by the way, because there's no point focusing on building and developing when one of the biggest challenges that we do have in this country is going to be infrastructure. So it's great to see that. And what's even better to see is that the Labour is going to be able to look at all the stakeholders that are involved in this. So looking at government departments, councils, private developers, infrastructure, just they have to look at this from a holistic point of view and put this. There's no point just looking at planning. Give me one sec. What have I done here? Yeah, increasing planning authorities, local planning authorities. So that is what we have from the King's Speech point of view. Now, I don't know if anyone listening to this has listened to the full speech, but there are things in here that may have been a surprise, maybe others that haven't. I have another. Yeah. So that's it for the King's Speech. With the Labour, of course, wanted to push things. I think the general narrative from Labour is we're going to get shit done, and we're going to get it done quickly, which is quite different from the Conservative, which obviously a lot of things were just lagging. So their emphasis is we're promising and we're delivering. Only time will tell. So I wanted to here jump on and talk about the market, and especially when it comes down to the housing market and where we are right now, because we had quite a few stats come out in the last couple of weeks, and I wanted to share this. I want to start with the housing market and then slowly start diving into the rental market and what impacts it's having for landlords, tenants, and what decisions, or I guess what's influencing landlords to make decisions to increase rents, and how much, and how these landlords are divided. So is it the landlords that have bigger portfolios who are pushing for more rent, or is it those accidental landlords who have smaller portfolios? So let's dive in. So house price growth. Let's look at nationwide. So nationwide, house price growth broadly stable in June. UK house prices up 1.5% in June compared with a year ago. Now, of course, this is showing something positive. Other stats show there's a negative. Other stats show it's flat. But I think if we take all the stats all together, here is a 1.5 positive. Over there's a negative of another 1%. And we take it all in all, I think we come to the conclusion that generally the housing market is pretty much flat, and dare I say it, dipping in some areas. There is also a geographic difference to this. If you've been following my live videos, you'll know that there is a great divide between the south and the north, and it will be interesting to dive in a little bit more into what these regions are and how it makes a difference. So monthly index. Sorry, let me look here. So UK house prices edged up by 0.2% in June after taking account of seasonal effects. This resulted in an annual rate growth rising from 1.3% in May to a 1.5% in June, leaving prices around 3% below the all-time high record in summer of 2022. And for those of you that were in the summer market of 2022, you'll know that it was a crazy market. I think they called it the race for space. So, housing market activity remains fairly subdued. Housing market activity has been broadly flat over the last year, with the total number of transactions down by around 15% compared to 2019 levels. I've said this before, I say it again. The fact that we've had a recession, a change of government, mortgage rates to a level that we haven't seen in many years, and yet the housing market continues to be flat, I think that's a positive. And of course, this is not taking into consideration inflation, because if we take into consideration inflation, we pretty much have had a property crash. Um, and I can talk about this all day, but this isn't the nature of this video today. If you want to find out more about what I'm talking about, and what do you mean there was a property crash, and when taken into consideration inflation, drop me a comment below and I'd be happy to perhaps do a video if there's a demand for it. So mixed picture amongst regions. Q2 2024, our regional house price are produced quarterly with data of Q2. Okay, so let's just look at this. So the Northern England and Southern England. So if you look at here, this is annual house price growth. So the red, you're seeing this? Yes, you can see it. So the red line is Northern England, and the blue one is Southern England. So you can see that Northern England is definitely leading the way. Let me see what other graph I have here. So hopefully you can see this. Annual house price change. Look at that. Look at the divide between the south and the north. So you got minus 10% on the pink, and the pink changes slightly. I don't know if you can see the color from here, but then here you can see there's growth up to 10 to 15% on the clearer blue. But it's just a massive only account, and I believe this is London, that has a bit of blue in there. Other than that, you can clearly see there's a huge divide, and that goes for the rental market as well, by the way. So, annual change in house prices, you can see here, London. You can see here, Northern Ireland. Wow. Northwest, Yorks, and the North. And then everything from there on, it starts going sort of flat, but then comes negative just in here. Oh, you're not seeing my screen. Apologies. So I'm not sure how much of that you managed to see with regards to the blue graph in here. So you can clearly see, and I love these visual graphs and notes and stats. I'm very visual, so this really helps. But you can clearly see the divide here between south and north. So it will be good to look at the rental market. Before we do, let's look at what other stats we have here. This is an interesting one, which is from Zoopla. So here's a Zoopla one. This was out in June, so just last month. And it does show that house price inflation was flat at 0% May 2024, but the UK prices are on track to be 1.5% higher by the end of 2024. So what I find interesting from this report is that, first of all, home buyers and sellers are shrugging off the election. They're carrying on. So it seems that they don't seem to be deterred by the recent outcome. House price inflation is static and is still negative in the south, as I've just shared. 75% of this year's sales are completed or in progress. The sales market has proved resilient. Housing remains overvalued. This is an interesting statement from Zoopla. So housing remains overvalued, but the trend is improving. One way we track affordability is to measure the extent to which actual house prices are higher or lower than an affordable house price. This is calculated from household incomes and mortgage rates. The recent jump in mortgage rates led to house prices being overvalued by 13% at the end of 2023. How they come to this conclusion, of course, they've shared with us some of the methodology. But that's interesting because I guess the market really is the one who determines what's overvalued and what's not. And I've said this before, whereby when there is a big impact on the market, whether that be an election, whether that be COVID, um, mortgage rates going through the roof, there's always going to be a time sort of lagging between sellers and landlords finding what's true market value and what's not overvalued. I mean, we were at a time whereby sellers thought it was still 2022 and properties were just flying off the shelf, and yet there were a time where buyers were stuck back in 2020 when COVID hit and no one wanted to buy, and vendors were just really desperate. It takes time to kind of find that level. So another thing to point this out, but let me show you this graph, if I may. Seems I can't expand. Oh, there you are. Okay. So hopefully you can see this in a bigger picture. So house prices on track to be fairly valued by end of 2024. So based on Zoopla's graph, we can see here in 1977, thereabouts, prices were round about value, right? Fair value based on this graph. And then somewhere as we went into the late 70s, then prices started to be overvalued. And then we came into the 80s, it came down somewhat and then peaked again towards the end of the 80s and then started climbing back up during the 90s and then just plummeted towards the end of the 90s and stayed down throughout up to 2000, 2004. It starts to climb back up. And of course, 2009, for those of you who have been following, the financial crisis hit. And then it just simply starts to go down again. And then 2012, it goes below that line and stays down up to around about 2022, where property prices go through the roof. Of course, that race for space and the lack of property just coming into the market. I mean, that's a big factor as well as to why property prices haven't plummeted. It's because the stock is just simply not available. One thing to point out is that this graph and this methodology, of course, uses mortgages. There are regions that use less amount of mortgage. I mean, I know parts of London, for example, that are at a certain price range and a price bracket that's very rare that buyers actually even use mortgages. So we've got to be careful as to different methodologies that certain companies use and how that impacts other regions of the country. So interest rates hold the key, and absolutely it does. And I know a lot of people are waiting for next month and to find out what's going to happen over the course of the next meeting of the Bank of England. I wouldn't hold my breath. For those of you who are waiting to buy a property because of the change of mortgage interest, I'm not quite sure, number one, whether it's actually even going to be any change downwards, at least next month, probably. But even if it was, it's going to be very, very minimum. It's not going to be much. And for those of you who are waiting, you're probably going to have to wait a good couple of years, in my opinion, what I've seen so far, for it to make any real any big impact. So there you are. And we'll jump into a little bit about mortgages, specifically buy-to-let mortgages, in a little bit, because some interesting things happening, very interesting things happening on that note. So we're done with the Zoopla house prices. Let's jump into a little bit on the rental. Okay, so this is the rental market report by June from Zoopla. So the rate at which rents are rising has slowed down by 6.6% for new lets, down from a high of 16% in October 2021. Of course, every boom has to slow down or bust, if you want to get fancy with words. Let's call it bust. It's just not sustainable. I'm sure a lot of landlords I've been speaking to is, they don't want to continue to increase rents, but we're going to talk about what's actually forcing landlords to increase rents. And the impact it's having on the rental market and, of course, on tenants. And I use that word very strategically, forced to increase rents, because I don't know a lot of landlords that like to increase rents just for the fun of it. There are a lot of costs involved, a lot of expenditure, and a lot of pressure on landlords and, of course, ultimately tenants. So, key figures: average rent new lets only April 1200, January 1223, and then 1219. So UK rental inflation lowest for 2.5 years. So if we look at this graph, I'm going to try and expand this. What we do know is London is the slowest to increase rent over the course of this time frame. So London is at 3.7% up. If you look at all the other areas surrounding and even up north, 8%, 7%, 7%. I mean, you even have here Southeast. Southeast overall 7.9%. And yet London is down, has only grown by 3.7%. I say only. I mean, the average, previously the average increase in rent per year was generally around about 3 to 5%. But this is now kind of a more normal rent increase between 3 to 5%. So the average monthly UK rent has risen by £80 in the last year, taking it to £1,200. Which is interesting is that the North now, most of the North, at least what I've seen, the rental is above £1,000. I mean, that's crazy. We used to see rental sort of £700, £600. Now these same areas are hitting around about £1,000. Which a lot of landlords have been asking, is it more lucrative to change our strategy, working from here in London to other areas such as the North? And that is a question that has a complex answer, and it depends on your strategy. So again, any of you guys listening to this and gals, if you want to find out a little bit more about that, just shoot me a comment, and we can definitely do a video as to London vs other parts of the UK. So rental inflation slows to a 30-month low. I mean, if we know, I'm going to share something with you. It's something we have learned over the course of the last 24 months. Okay, I couldn't find it, but what I am going to share with you, based on the same topic of rent, is why rents are increasing. And before I dive into these articles, there are many reasons why rent will increase. Market dynamics, whether that's supply and demand, the economy, and everything else. But let me share with you a few reasons why landlords are forced to increase rents where there is a direct impact to them. Let's talk about regulation first. Regulation. When we had the tax changes, first of all, when we had the tax change of Section 24, which stopped landlords being able to take their mortgage interest costs against their rental income, that had an impact. When we had the wear and tear allowance also changed completely, which was less favorable for landlords, that also has an impact. 2019 Tenant Fee Act ban, 2019, this didn't allow landlords to charge, or even letting agents charge tenants an administration fee, a referencing fee, all of this stuff. And is the landlord going to swallow that cost? Of course not. They're going to pass it on to the agents, or the agent's going to pass it on to the tenants. How? By increasing the rental income. Those are three just very simple examples there, without talking about the stamp duty. So even entering into the market is now also more expensive. So around about the same time, I couldn't remember the exact year, let's call it 2016 or thereabouts, stamp duty rules also changed. What they did was that if you were an investor, now suddenly you wouldn't have to pay the same stamp duty as everyone else. You now have to have a 3% surcharge. again, increase in cost. Now it means that landlords need to have, number one, a bigger capital to be able to invest. And what happens with that? Of course, we have less money and less cash flow. Then what's the solution? They increase the rent. All of this has been a factor in the increase of rents in the UK over the course of recent years. And then we look at regulations. What type of regulations? Well, you have the regulations such as the EPC. So they change the standards from, and by the way, I'm all for climate change, um, being proactive, and I know it's a threat, but there needs to be things that are gradually happening. You can't hit one stakeover again and again and again and again, and then not find that there's going to be an impact to the very people you're trying to help, which are renters. And that's exactly what's happened. EPC, they changed. The EPC, they changed it to a standard. I believe it's a, is it D? I can't remember. Let me put it up actually. So EPC rating below E. And when that change happened, a lot of landlords had to put their hand in the pocket, change boilers, change doors, change windows, whatever had to happen. And there are some incentives from the government, but I tell you, they are just not enough in terms of what the government will support landlords to be able to make these changes. Now, if that wasn't enough, of course, they implied that there was going to be even more changes. They're going to up that standard and to make the minimum even lower, so that so landlords again, being kind of ahead of the curve, started to change things, and it ended up that the government changed their mind and effectively didn't make those changes. But that's on the shelf at the moment. They will bring this up. So a lot of landlords are aware, hang on, we're going to have a change of the EPC, and I'm going to have to upgrade my EPC, which is the Energy Performance Certificate for those that are not familiar. And then you have the EICR as well, which is the Energy Certificate that also had an impact, costs £500, give or take, to get a report done. And then if you have any changes, you can be changing all the wiring in a property, having also an impact. So I just want to say there are financial costs that have been quite heavy to landlords over the course of the last few years. And what they've done is pass this on over to the renters by increasing the rent, let alone all the regulation. You may ask, well, how's regulations, new regulation or new legislation going to impact landlords needing them to? There are over 100, the last time I checked, there was over 172 legislations, regulations for landlords. Landlords, quite frankly, are scared. They don't know. They're not, it's not their day job to be on top of these things. So what they've done now is a lot of them are passing these properties onto agents so that the agents can take care of it and pay 12-15% of their rental income to make sure that their property is being managed, and they are not going to be risking getting fines and even being prosecuted by all the laws that are coming through. So we were on this topic here with regards to the cost. Landlords are passing on the cost. The most obvious explanation for landlords, which I didn't touch upon, left the best for last, is the interest rates. At 15-year highs, landlords have to pay more for their mortgages. So on top of all the things I've just shared with you, then to add even more on the plate, then the mortgage rates increase, and a lot of those landlords are now having to repackage those mortgages, and whereby before they had a mortgage that was, let's say, a 2.55% on a buy to let, and they were paying something along the lines of around about £1,000. Now they're coming to remortgage, and they're lucky to get away with anything around about 4.9% or 4.8% on a buy to let, increasing their mortgage to almost double. I did a change on this. By the way, if you want to dive deep on this, make sure you watch my video that's coming out over the weekend. If you're not subscribed, make sure you do subscribe so you don't miss it. And it's going to talk about this in detail with numbers and figures, and just shows you the change of a landlord 8 years ago, 5 years ago, and what they're paying now. So on this example, they're paying almost £2,000, so almost double as what they were paying before. And that's together with not having the tax relief, of course, and other costs, which I've just shared. So, as you can tell, very passionate about this. I want a fairer system for both landlords and tenants, and so we can find, because it's not fair on renters as well. I'll be honest, it's hard out there. I know there are a lot of renters struggling. You know, a lot of. I was born and raised here in London, and London is the one of the most, if not the most expensive out of all the country. And I have family, I have friends, you know, and the rent is something that's always, you know, at the top of the agenda when it comes to the cost that they have, representing around about 40%. Sometimes even more. So we do need action. We do need to change the way that the UK operates. So the most obvious explanation for landlords increasing rents is that, okay, as I said, it's mortgage rates. Not enough homes are being built. And I think this is the focus. I'm so glad to see Labour focusing on this, not just focusing on landlords, because that is only the symptom of the problem. The problem is right here, guys, right here. More homes will stabilize the housing market, but also the rental market. So, what is this graph? Not so fast. The rate the UK's population increase has been much slower in 2020 and in 2021, annual percentage change basis. Oh, interest. So annual percentage change and population, the blue one here. Interesting. I hadn't seen this graph before. What I do know from seeing other graphs is that the population is increasing at a very rapid rate. What I do know is that half of the population actually lives in urban areas, and that number is going to double by some point in 2050. So that's what I do know. So that's an interesting graph to see. But certainly, people who are investing in property are investing in urban areas. That's the way to go. Which is interesting looking at the COVID period. They said everyone was leaving the city and that trend was going to continue. Well, it doesn't seem that way. Yes, there is some preference for some people who have the flexibility, but overall, I'm seeing a reverse of that. So let's look at an interesting. Let's look at this one. So, average rent now 25% higher than before COVID, says leading expert. Okay, so this was back in 2023. So, this is not an article perhaps that we want to share, at least not right now. So this one was so we're raising rents in the next year amidst vast majority of landlords. The majority of buy-to-let landlords raise rents the coming 12 months. And this article was out just last week or this week. Some 85% of landlords went for a raise. And of those, 36% plan to raise rents by up to 5%. Meanwhile, 37% intend to increase rents between 6 to 10%. Fewer than 1 in 10 landlords plan to raise rents between 11 to 19%. And of course, I mean, the landlords don't get to dictate, of course, how much rents are going to increase. It also has a ceiling based on the wages that tenants have, as well as other dynamics in the market. But it's interesting what they plan to do and whether they can actually implement it from a market demand point of view. So among those looking to raise rents, 42% is made up of landlords with portfolios between 4 and 10 properties. 42%, guys. Now, followed by those with 20 plus properties at 28%. So between 4 and 10, 40%, and 20 plus property, and those who have 20 plus property make up 28%. So we're looking at, what's that, 40, 60, 65%, give or take, right? My math's a bit wrong here. So actually 70%, over 70%. So it's interesting to find out, what about the other 30%? Rob Staton, a sales and distribution director at Landbay, the company which commissioned by survey. So whereas before, rising rents would often reflect the increasing demand of good quality rental accommodation, today's market now means that landlords also have to factor in higher interest rates and higher operating costs. And those operating costs, by the way, as I said before, is not only exclusively based on agents, but it's also factoring in the inflation that has come in. Everything is so much more expensive. I mean, before a call out charge would be anything between sort of £45 or something like that. Right now, call out charge would be anything between £80 and £100. So it's not only based on the agent's fees and what landlords are paying, it's also the overall cost of everything. The referencing cost, the inventory cost, changing appliance, replacing contractors, everything has just gone through the roof, and those costs inevitably are being passed down to on rent, passed down to the renters. So I'm conscious of the time. Those of you who've been sticking with me, I appreciate it very much. I appreciate you and jumping on. Make sure you do subscribe. And the last point I wanted to talk about here was mortgages. And I won't take too much based on this, but I just found this so interesting. So here, mortgage lender encourage landlords to sell to tenants at cut price. So this is a bit of an innovation, right? So and it actually, we if you followed my video, you know that I've talked about how the government incentivizing the last government was incentivizing landlords to sell up, giving them a percentage decrease deduction from the capital gain tax. I believe it was 28%, and it was down by 2-3 points. And it seems almost that the lenders are doing the same. So a mortgage lender has introduced products which effectively encourages landlords to sell to a sitting tenant at a discounted price. The so-called concessionary mortgage offered by TSB works like this, according to the lender. If you're a landlord and sell your property to your tenant with a 10% discount or more, the tenant doesn't need a single penny towards the deposit. I'll repeat that. If the landlord sells to the tenant at a 10% discount, the tenant doesn't need a penny as a deposit to buy that property. Now, you might be thinking, why on earth, as a landlord, would I want to sell at a discount? Well, I guess the theory behind this is you save yourself the hassle, number one. Number two, you may save for yourself as well the agency fees, right? So, as an example, if you have a property that's cost £500,000, the average fee is going to be around about 2%, dare I say it. And so you're going to save yourself that money. So around about 10 grand, give or take. And just the hassle of the whole process. I mean, I know a lot of people say that selling a property could be quite stressful. This is especially for homeowners as well, but I've seen landlords as well. But does this work in practice? And do the numbers actually work? Because effectively, could you be getting more money for your property than what you actually think is market value? And then on top of that, you're actually given a 10% discount. So what lenders say is market value and what you actually can sell it on the real market can be two different things. So I fear that this method or this strategy could leave landlords leaving money on the table. Leave me your opinion. I could be wrong. Tell me what your thoughts are. But very interesting and innovative way of doing mortgages. And I guess there was another one here. This was another article. And this article was really based. I mean, I talked about interest rates and how landlords were forced to increase the rents. And it's true. There is some truth in that. There are landlords who don't have any mortgages, and the mortgage-free landlords who are raising the rents. They're just cashing in, right? So they're just using this rent increase, which other landlords are just forced to do because of interest rates. But I mean, it's supply and demand, isn't it? I think that it would be not sensible for landlords who are in this position to increase the rents to the absolute maximum. If there is some flexibility and you have a tenant in place who's been there for a while and you have that flexibility, it just sounds crazy that you wouldn't. But I know landlords that absolutely do. They're mortgage free and they always allow that flexibility for those tenants because they are in the fortunate position to do so, and therefore they pass that on to the landlords. But here you are. According to a poll, more than 1,000 landlords commissioned by the housing charity Shelter and shared with the Guardian, 7 out of 10 who own their rental properties outright increased rents on new or extended tenancy in the past 12 months, as their average profits rose to more than 800 per month. And again, yes, it could be true that they're increasing rents, but there is also a major factor to this, and that is if they decide to sell it up at some point and their rents are massively undervalued, that's going to be an issue for them. If they suddenly do want to take out a mortgage because something suddenly happens and their rent is massively undervalued, again, they're going to be in trouble. Also, from a perspective of the buyer who buy to let, assuming there's going to be another buy to let buyer for that property and they see the rent is massively undervalued, they're going to ask why, and that landlord's going to have challenges as well. I hope all of this makes sense. I know there are some questions before I wrap up, so I'm going to go ahead and try and answer some of these. And if I got carried away, it's just because I'm so passionate about all these topics. Okay, so let's dive into some of these questions. So, Martha, thank you very much for jumping in. I know you are a very, very loyal listener. You tune in. So, was eagerly waiting for you to go live. Okay, yeah. How do you foresee the new legislation outlined in the King's Speech affecting landlords in the short and long term? So, listen, I've shared a lot about this. It's really having clarity. So now that the King has, included in the King's Speech, so at least landlords can have a little bit more clarity. I know it's happening for landlords to adjust. It really depends. Wise process as to which one of these you are talking about. If you're talking about Section 21 as an example, really there's really nothing to prepare as long as the government actually puts in place the mechanisms to be able to navigate if the landlord is having challenges with those tenants, if the landlord wants to sell, if the landlord suddenly is homeless and wants to go into that home, or family members. As long as the government puts the right mechanisms in place, they can do away with Section 21. Let's not forget, a buy-to-let property isn't an aspirational property. It's a functional property, and it's there to serve a purpose, which is for rent. So, or to let the property. So I'm not worried. I think anyone who's worried with Section 21, either number one, doesn't understand the other mechanisms that are in place, or number two, I'm sorry, but are crap landlords that want to do something with the tenants that are just simply doesn't make sense. If the tenant is paying their rent, then why would you want to evict your your tenant? Why would you? If they're not paying their rent, then there are other vehicles to be able to evict that tenant, and you don't need Section 21. Yes, it makes it easier, of course, but there are other mechanisms. And as long as the courts are functional and are kept up to date, I can't see why these other mechanisms couldn't work. But the government do have to put this in place. I must emphasize the courts need to be fit for purpose. So how can landlords better navigate the balance between monitoring maintaining tenant satisfaction and complying with the new regulations? So hi, Anna. So the balance, I'm not really sure what you mean by the balance. So by maintaining tenant satisfaction, by complying with these regulations, naturally the you should be able to increase that tenant satisfaction. But of course, it's not only about the regulations, Anna, it's also about expectations. So what we know more about tenants now, especially as rents increase more and more, there is an expectation there to have a better service, but also have a better condition of property. And that's just a natural approach. You increase something, whether that is a product, a service, then naturally people will expect a better quality. So it has to go hand in hand. Martha, as investors, are there new opportunities or areas for property investment that landlords should consider in the current climate? That's a great question. And I believe that number one, landlords who have properties that are not on the market but want to offload some of those properties, speak to your agents, find out what properties are out there that are off market. I think that provides a great opportunity. And for that, you need to have a great relationship with agents out there. And number two is there are certain regions for sure in London as well, not only in the north, but it really depends on what your strategy is and what you're looking to achieve with your investment, Martha, because it's not just that. It's not as simple as, oh, I can get more yield in a different place, so that's a better investment. There's a lot to be said about capital growth, and some areas that give some great yields, number one, are risky in terms of the type of tenant that you can get, or don't provide the capital growth that you would expect. And capital growth is always where you win as opposed to yield. And if you want a video about that, just shoot me a comment. Guys and gals that are watching this, your comments are really helpful because it helps me to understand exactly what you want to hear about and what's important to you. And I really appreciate the support that I get with these live videos. Subscribe, like, it really motivates me to keep on pushing more of these out there. So, what else do we have? Sorry for bombarding you. Another question, but what steps do you think we can take to maintain profitability amidst these legislative market changes? Wise process, the best thing you can do, especially from a Section 24 point of view, is this is you need to speak to a tax expert. What is the most efficient and tax efficient way to transfer your buy-to-let properties that you may have on your name and incorporate them? Sometimes there isn't a simple answer to that, and it may well be that you need to restructure. What that means, sell your properties and start again from scratch, because it's more expensive transferring those. I'm not a tax expert, so I wouldn't be the best person to tell you, but that would be the number one and foremost, so you can be able to get the tax incentives or tax reliefs that we used to get before. Perfect, straightforward answer. We're expecting. Great. Are you planning to invite a tax expert on a live video? So I'm excited to share with you that we will be getting some guests in, and that's going to include tax expert, legal experts, mortgage experts, and so much more. So watch this space and stay tuned. Thank you so much for tuning in. Have a great evening and stay safe.